Lakeside Terrace basked in the soft glow of the setting sun, its reputation as the most sought-after dining experience in the city well deserved. The restaurant was an elegant retreat perched beside a glassy lake, where even the light seemed to shine differently, warmer, softer, more forgiving. Rows of manicured hedges framed the outdoor patio, their symmetry a quiet testament to the precision that defined the place. The gentle trickle of a nearby fountain, paired with the occasional clink of crystal glasses, created an atmosphere of hushed luxury. Servers in crisp white uniforms moved gracefully among the patrons, their trays balanced with the precision of dancers on a stage. Every detail was curated, from the polished silverware to the subtle floral arrangements gracing each table. At Lakeside Terrace, diners came not just for the food but for the quiet reassurance that they were exactly where they belonged. At the top, seated at the most enviable table, one with an unbroken view of the lake's still waters, sat Jonathan Pierce. At 68, Jonathan embodied the very image of accomplishment. His hair, silver but meticulously styled, lent him a dignified presence that matched his perfectly tailored suit. His empire, built on equal parts ingenuity and relentless ambition, had propelled him from modest beginnings to the pinnacles of technology and real estate. And yet, as he gazed out at the horizon, there was a gravity in his expression, a shadow of weariness that no amount of success could erase. Across from him sat his wife, Victoria Pierce. In her early 40s, Victoria was an enigma of sophistication. Her honey-blonde hair fell in soft waves, framing a face that seemed untouched by time or trouble. She wore a pearl necklace that gleamed faintly in the fading sunlight, a quiet testament to the life of privilege she inhabited. Yet behind the flawless exterior, there was something else, an air of distance, a quiet detachment. As she sipped from her glass of sparkling water, her gaze wandered, not to her husband, but to something indeterminate, as if her thoughts carried her far beyond the table they shared. Just beyond the patio's ornate railing, Emily Carter hovered in the shadows, her small figure blending into the background. At only 10 years old, Emily had the wary eyes of someone far older. Her tangled brown hair fell across her face, streaked with dirt, while her oversized sweatshirt hung loosely on her small frame. She had no place in a setting like Lakeside Terrace, but she lingered all the same, drawn by the tantalizing sense of seared fish and roasted vegetables wafting from the kitchen. Emily had wandered into this part of town by accident, a mix of curiosity and the promise of food pulling her steps. She clung to the railing, her stomach rumbling as she watched diners delicately spear morsels from plates that seemed almost too perfect to touch. Her gaze darted from one table to the next, taking in the opulence with a mixture of wonder and longing. But it was the couple at the table with the lake view that held her attention. Jonathan and Victoria. Something about them was different, even beyond their obvious wealth. Jonathan exuded a quiet authority that seemed to ripple outward, while Victoria moved with the precision of someone acutely aware of every eye upon her. Emily couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to their table, her sharp eyes catching small details. The way Jonathan glanced at the menu but didn't seem to read it. The way Victoria's fingers rested a little too lightly on her glass, as if she were only pretending to drink. As the minutes passed, Emily's hunger gnawed at her, but she didn't move. Something about the scene unfolding before her felt off, though she couldn't yet say why. She watched as Jonathan finally set his phone aside, shifting his focus toward the menu in front of him. Across from him, Victoria's gaze lingered elsewhere, her perfectly composed features betraying nothing. Her movements were subtle, practiced, and easy to miss if not for Emily's attentive gaze. Then, Victoria reached into her handbag. Emily tensed, her wide eyes fixed on the delicate way Victoria withdrew something small from inside. A vial. Clear, nondescript, and unremarkable to anyone not paying attention. Victoria's fingers curled around it with practiced ease, her movements deliberate yet unhurried. She tilted her head slightly, her lips forming a faint smile, as if nothing at all was amiss. But Emily's instincts, honed by years of survival, told her otherwise. Her stomach growled again, louder this time, but Emily didn't notice. Her focus was entirely on the small, glittering vial in Victoria's hand. Something about it prickled the back of her mind, and she leaned slightly closer to the railing, her heart pounding. Victoria glanced around, her serene expression unchanging as she tilted the vial, releasing a few drops into Jonathan's steaming bowl of clam chowder. The liquid disappeared immediately, melting into the soup without a trace. With a slight flick of her wrist, Victoria tucked the vial back into her bag and casually picked up her spoon, stirring Jonathan's soup with the practiced ease of someone simply being attentive. Emily's breath caught. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she'd just seen. She didn't know what was in the vial or why Victoria had added it to the soup, but her instincts screamed that it wasn't right. She wanted to look away, to let it go. It wasn't her business after all. But her feet stayed rooted to the ground. From her spot behind the railing, Emily watched Jonathan lift his spoon, pausing briefly as he glanced at his wife. Time seemed to slow, and Emily's chest tightened as she realized he was seconds away from taking a bite. Something wasn't right. She could feel it, deep and certain. Her fingers gripped the railing tightly, her knuckles turning white as she whispered to herself, "Don't eat it." Emily's heart pounded as she gripped the wrought iron railing, her knuckles white with tension. The fading sunlight painted the patio in hues of gold and orange, but she barely noticed. All she could see was Jonathan, his spoon poised over the bowl of clam chowder, and Victoria, her composed expression betraying none of the sinister act Emily was certain she had witnessed. Her mind raced. What if she was wrong? What if no one believed her? But as Jonathan tilted his head slightly toward the bowl, a resolute determination surged through her small frame. The truth burned within her, and she couldn't let the moment pass. "Don't eat that." Emily's voice cut through the air, high-pitched but clear and unwavering. The patio stilled as though someone had pressed pause on the bustling scene. Conversations halted, the clinking of glasses stopped, and all eyes turned toward the scrappy figure standing just beyond the railing. Jonathan froze mid-motion, his sharp, calculating gaze darting toward the source of the interruption. Emily took a deep breath, her chest heaving as she pointed a trembling finger toward their table. "She put something in your soup," she said, her voice cracking slightly but still firm. The words landed like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples of shock through the diners. Forks hovered in midair, and hushed murmurs rippled across the crowd. Waiters glanced nervously at one another, unsure whether to intervene. Victoria's expression, usually so polished and serene, remained calm, but a flicker of panic crossed her eyes, a momentary betrayal of the confidence she worked so hard to project. She raised her chin slightly, as if to assert control. "This is preposterous," she said smoothly, her voice laced with incredulity. She gestured toward Emily with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "Jonathan, she's just a little girl, probably hungry or looking for attention. Don't let her ruin our evening." Jonathan's face remained unreadable as he set his spoon down gently, folding his hands in front of him. His piercing gaze shifted from Emily to his wife. "What is she talking about, Victoria?" he asked, his voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of suspicion. Victoria's laugh was light, but there was a brittleness to it that hadn't been there moments ago. "Really, Jonathan," she said, shaking her head as if the whole situation was too absurd for words. "She's a street kid. You know how they can be, making up stories, trying to cause a scene. She probably wants money." Emily's chest tightened, but she held her ground. She wasn't about to let her words be dismissed so easily. Taking a step closer to the railing, she fixed her wide brown eyes on Jonathan. "I saw her," she cried, her voice rising with desperation. "She took a little bottle out of her purse and poured something into your soup when you weren't looking." Gasps rippled through the patio. The diner's eyes darted between Emily and the couple at the center of the growing storm. Some looked at Victoria, their expressions clouded with doubt. Others gazed at Emily with a mix of pity and curiosity. A man seated at a nearby table leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Why would a child make up something like that?" Another woman frowned, her gaze flickering to Victoria. "She does seem awfully quick to dismiss it." The murmurs swelled, the weight of the growing scrutiny pressing on Victoria. Still, she maintained her composure, her polished facade showing only the faintest cracks. Enough of this nonsense, Victoria snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut through the rising tension. She turned to the restaurant's manager, who had been hovering near the edge of the patio, his expression tight with uncertainty. "Can you please remove this child? She's disturbing everyone." The manager hesitated, his gaze shifting between Victoria and Emily. The little girl's ragged appearance contrasted sharply with Victoria's impeccable elegance, but something in Emily's eyes, her sheer conviction, gave him pause. "Perhaps we should investigate the claim," the manager said carefully, his tone neutral. Victoria's composure slipped further, her lips tightening as her eyes darted toward Jonathan. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Are you really entertaining the word of a child over mine?" Jonathan's silence stretched, heavy and unyielding. His sharp eyes never left Victoria's face. "I think," he said slowly, "we owe it to ourselves to listen." The quiet authority in his tone silenced even the murmuring diners. All eyes were now on Victoria, who seemed momentarily frozen, as though calculating her next move. Emily's hands clenched the railing, her small body trembling from a mixture of fear and determination. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the collective judgment of strangers who had no reason to trust her word. But despite her fear, she stood firm. Jonathan turned to the manager. "Call the police," he said simply. The declaration sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. The manager nodded stiffly, pulling out his phone to make the call. Victoria's carefully curated calm shattered for a brief moment as her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. "This is absurd," she hissed, leaning toward Jonathan. "You're seriously going to let this ridiculous accusation go this far? It's a waste of time." Jonathan met her gaze, his expression hard. "If there's nothing to hide, then we have nothing to worry about." Emily exhaled shakily, relief mingling with anxiety as the sirens in the distance signaled the arrival of the police. The tension on the patio was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone, from the diners to the waitstaff, seemed to hold their breath as the situation unfolded. For the first time in her young life, Emily felt the power of her voice. How it could command attention, shift the balance of a moment, and perhaps change the course of someone's life. The patio of Lakeside Terrace was uncharacteristically quiet, the tranquil atmosphere now taut with anticipation. Conversations had long since faded, replaced by the uneasy rustle of shifting chairs and murmured speculations. The gentle trickle of the fountain seemed almost deafening against the heavy silence. A few minutes later, the shrill wail of approaching sirens broke through the stillness, their sound growing louder as they neared. The diners exchanged wide-eyed glances, some leaning closer to their companions, their whispers barely audible. Two uniformed officers stepped onto the patio, their presence immediately commanding attention. Their measured steps were purposeful, their gazes sharp as they scanned the scene. One officer, a tall man with graying temples, approached the table where Jonathan, Victoria, and Emily sat at the center of the storm. His partner, a younger officer with a notebook in hand, stayed close, their roles clearly defined. "Good evening," the elder officer began, his voice calm but firm. "We've received a report about a serious accusation. We'll need to ask some questions." Victoria's head turned sharply toward Jonathan, her expression unreadable but her shoulders stiff. Her manicured fingers fidgeted slightly against the edge of the table, the first visible crack in her otherwise poised demeanor. "Of course, officer," Jonathan said, his tone even, though his gaze remained fixed on Victoria. "We'll cooperate fully." Emily, standing a few feet from the railing now, swallowed hard but nodded, her wide eyes reflecting both fear and resolve. The officers split their attention between Victoria and Emily, their questions deliberate and probing. "Miss," the younger officer said gently, crouching slightly to meet Emily's gaze. "You're the one who called this out, correct? Can you tell us exactly what you saw?" Emily nodded quickly, her voice trembling but determined. "I saw her," she said, pointing toward Victoria. "She took a little bottle out of her purse and poured something into his soup when he wasn't looking. I swear I saw it, The officer nodded, jotting down notes. And you're certain it was something unusual? Emily hesitated for a moment before nodding again. Yes. It didn't look like anything you'd add to food. It was clear, like water, but it wasn't right. The elder officer turned his attention to Victoria, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Ma'am, do you have any response to this accusation? Victoria straightened her posture, her polished mask slipping back into place. Her laugh, soft and controlled, was aimed at disarming. Officer, this is preposterous, she said smoothly. She's a child. I'm sure she's mistaken or simply seeking attention. The younger officer glanced at Emily, whose cheeks flushed but whose stance remained firm. Perhaps, the elder officer replied, his tone cool. But we'll need to ask for your consent to examine your bag, ma'am. If there's nothing to hide, this should clear things up quickly. Victoria stiffened imperceptibly, her eyes darting toward her handbag. For the briefest moment, her carefully composed exterior flickered with uncertainty. Is that really necessary? She asked, her voice soft but carrying a trace of irritation. It's a standard procedure in cases like this, the officer replied evenly. Jonathan's gaze remained locked on his wife. His silence spoke volumes, his sharp eyes studying her every movement. Under the weight of the scrutiny, Victoria's facade began to crumble. Her attempts to brush off the accusations faltered as the officers pressed her. The elder officer's firm tone cut through her defenses, and the subtle tension in her shoulders grew more pronounced. Finally, the truth spilled out, not in careful words but in a burst of anger and frustration. Fine, Victoria snapped, her voice trembling. Yes, I did it. The diners collectively gasped, the sound rippling across the patio like a wave. All eyes turned to Victoria as the polished, serene woman they had admired moments ago now seemed like a stranger. Her eyes flashed with a mixture of fury and despair as she continued, the words tumbling out unchecked. You don't understand. He's impossible to live with, always in control, always the one who wins. Do you know how suffocating that is? This was my chance to take back control. To finally be free. The officers exchanged a brief glance, their expressions unreadable as they moved to detain her. Ma'am, please stand up, the elder officer said firmly. Victoria hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze darting toward Jonathan, who sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Then, with a resigned sigh, she rose to her feet, the elegant composure she had worn so effortlessly all evening now shattered. The younger officer gently but efficiently placed handcuffs on her wrists, the faint metallic click sending another ripple of shock through the crowd. As she was led away, Victoria's defiance dimmed, replaced by a hollow stare. Her carefully crafted veneer had crumbled entirely, leaving behind a woman exposed and undone. Jonathan remained seated, his hands resting on the edge of the table, trembling slightly as the weight of the revelation settled over him. The untouched bowl of soup sat before him, its surface reflecting the fading sunlight. The diners whispered among themselves, their voices a mix of disbelief and judgment. A scene that began as an interruption by a street child had escalated into a moment no one present would forget. Emily stood rooted to the spot, her wide eyes fixed on Jonathan. She hadn't expected her voice to carry this far, hadn't anticipated the depth of the truth she had unveiled. The murmurs of the crowd faded into a low hum as the officers led Victoria away, her elegant figure now a shadow of its former self. The patio, so vibrant and luxurious just moments ago, seemed to hold its collective breath. Jonathan Pierce remained seated, his usually commanding presence diminished as he sat back in his chair, pale and visibly shaken. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the polished tablecloth. His gaze was fixed on the untouched bowl of clam chowder before him, its steam now barely rising into the cool evening air. For a long moment, he didn't speak, the enormity of what had just unfolded weighing down on him like a leaden shroud. Finally, he lifted his eyes to Emily, the small girl whose voice had shattered not just the calm of the evening but the fragile illusion of his life. Her brown eyes, wide and uncertain, reflected an innocence tempered by hard realities far beyond her years. "You saved my life," Jonathan said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Emily shifted awkwardly under the weight of his gaze, her hands gripping the railing as though to steady herself. She had no words for his gratitude, no way to explain that she hadn't done this for thanks or reward. All she knew was that she couldn't have stood by and let him eat that soup, not after what she had seen. "I just couldn't let it happen," Emily murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan studied her for a moment longer, his sharp eyes softening. Beneath the dirt smudging her cheeks and the weariness etched into her small frame, he saw something rare, an inner strength and courage that belied her age. With a steadying breath, he pulled his phone from his pocket. In a low tone, he made a call, the conversation brief but purposeful. Emily watched him warily, unsure what to expect. When he finished, Jonathan turned back to her. "You don't have to go back out there tonight," he said gently. "I've arranged for you to stay somewhere safe. Just for now, until we figure out something more permanent." Emily's eyes widened in surprise, and she took a small step back. I don't need anything," she stammered, her voice tinged with hesitation. "You need a place to rest," Jonathan said, his tone firm but kind. "And maybe I need to start repaying what you've given me tonight. Please, let me help." Emily hesitated, her instincts warning her against trusting too easily. But there was something in Jonathan's voice, something genuine, unpolished, and full of remorse, that softened her resistance. Slowly, she nodded, though her expression remained cautious. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, casting long, amber shadows across the patio, Jonathan rose from his seat. He gestured for the manager, who hurried over with an air of subdued solemnity. Quiet instructions were exchanged, and soon, a car was waiting to take Emily to a safe place for the night. Before she left, Jonathan knelt slightly to meet her at eye level. "You've reminded me," he said, his voice soft but resolute, "that doing the right thing doesn't always come with recognition or reward. Sometimes it's just about being brave enough to act." Emily looked at him, the tension in her small shoulders easing slightly. "I just didn't want you to get hurt," she said simply. Jonathan's lips curved into the faintest smile. "And that's what makes you remarkable." As Emily stepped into the waiting car, the weight of the day's events began to settle over the restaurant once more. The diners, many still seated at their tables, seemed quieter, more contemplative. Whispers drifted between them, but their tone had shifted from shock to admiration. That night, as the stars reflected on the still surface of the lake, the events of the day became more than just an extraordinary incident. They became a lesson etched into the memories of all who witnessed them, a reminder of the quiet strength that can emerge from the most unexpected places. Emily Carter, a 10-year-old girl with tangled hair and a fearless heart, had changed the course of Jonathan Pierce's life. Her courage, born of instinct and integrity, proved that heroism doesn't require power, wealth, or influence. Sometimes all it takes is the willingness to speak up when no one else will. Jonathan stood at the edge of the patio, watching the car disappear into the night. For the first time in years, he felt something stir deep within him, something he hadn't realized was missing: hope. And as the evening breeze rippled across the lake, he resolved that the second chance he'd been given would not be wasted.